Hey friends, so today we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson's presidency. In class, before you watch this video, we discussed the controversy that is Thomas Jefferson and how many of the things he says and does are different from things that he says and does later. For example, he was a very rich man and he loved elite clothing and elite food and wines and cheeses, and yet he dreamed of America being this where everyone's equal, egalitarian, rural farmers. Another controversy we discussed in class was the fact that in the Declaration of Independence, he wrote that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and yet he owned slaves. And we looked at quotes in class about the controversy of him seeing slaves as inferior, but also needing to be free and slavery as a necessary evil, and how we don't 100% know his opinion on this large institution of slavery. So let's dive into politically what he believed and what he did. So Jefferson as a president right there, there's a little meme about his controversy again. He was elected in 1800 and is often called by him and others of his party the Revolution of 1800, and here's why. Essentially, it's significant for its unprecedented, democratic, peaceful transfer of political power, a revolution with no bloodshed. So Washington had Federalist policies, even though he didn't ascribe to the party. Adams was a Federalist. Those were our only two presidents, and then boom, we peacefully elect a president from a different political party with different political beliefs. It shows that a two-party system with democracy does in fact work. And in his inaugural speech, he said, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." And he's trying to get the moderate Federalists to join his side, essentially. He's very much, though, alienating Hamilton and the high Federalists. Those were the super elite Federalists that believe that democracy is dangerous, essentially. Jefferson, as a president, even though he isn't a Democratic Republican, he will be much more moderate as his time during his time as president than he was before president and his beliefs, and we're going to talk about why today. So as a president, I like to think that he was less pretentious, and here's why. Here's some examples. So within the Federalist practice of presidency with Adams and Washington, they would make personal appearances which seemed like king-like speeches, monarchical speeches from the throne, and they would dress very fancy, whereas Jefferson would sometimes just send an assistant to go read a speech for him instead of him showing up himself. He established at the White House, they have lots of dinners and levees and parties and balls, and he did a lot less of those. But the English custom of the time that Washington and Adams continued was at these parties, at official state dinners, you would seat people based on their rank. So the important people would be at the top of the table next to Jefferson, and the less important people would be at the very end. And Jefferson didn't do that. No ranks and seating at his every so often parties. He also rode horseback wherever he was going. Before, for example, George Washington, when he was on horseback, he would only ride a white horse to look showy and important, because white horses were symbolic of royalty. And when he rolled into town, he'd get off a horse and into a fancy carriage and wave from the carriage into town, whereas Jefferson just rode horseback everywhere, whatever horse he could find. So he's just less, he's more normal, I guess, more close to the common people, even though he himself is very rich and has nice clothes and nice food and nice house. One thing that is different from him versus the other two presidents is that during this time period, the wealthier ranks saw the poorer ranks as dirty and that they shouldn't mix. And so they wouldn't shake hands with citizens and regular people. Thomas Jefferson does do that, in fact, okay? One thing that I love about Thomas Jefferson as well is oftentimes when callers would come to the White House, and dignitaries and governors and people from state governments would come, they were shocked when Thomas Jefferson would shake whoever's hand, and he didn't dress very well. Like, essentially, he had these nice fancy clothes, but he didn't always wear them. He just wore what he wanted to. It's kind of the equivalent of you showing up in your pajamas when someone comes over to come see you. He just did not care what people thought about the throne, the image of the president. He didn't want it to look king-like. Okay, so Jefferson is interesting because he is a Democratic Republican with those anti-Federalist faction feelings. But what he does during his presidency doesn't show that. He keeps many Federalist policies in place just for the greater good, essentially. So he reverses some policies of the Federalists, but keeps a lot. So that's why I call it the old switcheroo. So essentially what he does keep is he keeps many of the public servants, many of the people working for the government keep their jobs under him. He maintains the Bank of the United States, the BUS. Much of the Hamiltonian system remains intact. In fact, mild protective tariffs, that's tax on imports, remain intact. And the funding at par to pay off the U.S. debt and the assumption of state debts stays intact as well. Although when he was a private citizen working for Washington, he hated those things. And now that he's president, he has the power to get rid of them, and he doesn't. He is a pragmatist, not an idealist. Here's the difference. An idealist has their political beliefs, and they go with them, and they're stubborn and stick to them no matter what. Jefferson is a pragmatist. He has his beliefs and he feels them very strongly, but he does not do them if they're not for the greater good. So he sees that some of these Federalist policies are still working, are still effective in America, and he doesn't change them, even though they go against what he believes about government in his heart. Pragmatism, okay? However, he does get rid of some Federalist policies under the Alien and Sedition Act of John Adams. Sedition is when you write bad things about the government or publish bad things about the government. Many people had been given fines or thrown in jail. Jefferson pardons many of those. He gets rid of fines and often, actually a few times, gives back fines that people had paid for this breaking the Sedition Act. He also ends the Alien Act. The Alien Act essentially said that if you're an immigrant, you had to live in the States for 14 years before you were a citizen and could vote and have the rights of a citizen. He changed that and puts it back to its original policy of you have to live here for 5 years to be a citizen. And he does get rid of the excise tax. The most famous excise tax, nowadays we call it a sin tax, during this time was on whiskey. So he gets rid of Hamilton's whiskey tax. Okay, the government that governs least governs best. He believed strongly in reducing the size of the government and creating a government that is responsive to the people, a government for the people. So here's what he is successful at in that. He balances the budget by cutting government spending and also trying to cut the debt, a smaller government, so we shouldn't be in debt as much. So the debt was at 80 million, and then he purchased Louisiana Purchase, so up to 95 million, and he cut it down by cutting the size of the government, cutting programs, cutting parts of the bureaucracy, and paying down that debt. He cut that debt down to 57 million during his time period, even with the 15 million that the Louisiana Purchase cost. We're going to get to that in a minute. He ended property taxes. He reduced the Army and completely got rid of the Navy, which is going to come back to bite him in the butt. And he very much emphasizes states' rights as a way to respond to the people. Government for the people. Well, who's closest to them? The states, he believes. So he believes that states should have a little bit more power than what they had under the Federalist government. Okay? Let me go back real quick. So a little bit more on this part here. He encouraged the development of an agrarian nation. Agrarian meaning farming, egalitarian meaning people are all equal. So he wanted middle class and lower class farmers to be the norm in America. And at this point it is. It's going to change here actually within his presidency. Okay. Also passed during this time is the 12th Amendment. Essentially what brought on the 12th Amendment was there was a tie vote between presidential candidates of the same party in election of 1800. So Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson were both running as Democratic Republicans. The electors it went to the House of Representatives and they decide among the top three. Well, then we had Alexander Hamilton say to his buddies in Congress, hey, vote for Thomas Jefferson and not Aaron Burr, and gave reasons why. And essentially the 12th Amendment says that electors had to specify that they were voting for one presidential candidate and one vice presidential candidate. So at this moment in time, Thomas Jefferson wins and the loser becomes the next person with the most votes becomes the vice president, and that was Aaron Burr, and they did not get along, and it was an issue, and there was tension there. So the 12th Amendment is going to help change that so that electors are specifically voting for one presidential candidate and one vice presidential candidate, and nowadays they all run on one ticket. Okay, during this time period, John Adams, right before he left the presidency, appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And we're going to be learning more about specific court cases in class. We're only going to talk about one today in this lecture. So So, the Judiciary Act of 1801 is something that John Adams passes really quick in the midnight hours, not actually at midnight, but in the last few days of his presidency. The Judiciary Act adds 16 judgeships and positions, and he appoints people to these new judge positions within the federal court system, and it expands it. And of course, Adams is a Federalist, so he appoints Federalists in the hopes that after he's gone, they'll continue doing Federalist stuff. It's their way to stick it to Republicans on their way out the door. We call these judges midnight judges. You see the cool pickup line on the right? Because in the midnight hours, not actually midnight, of Adams' presidency, he appoints them, and thus their commission has to be approved by a number of people for them to be appointed, and it's going to be a point of contention here in a minute we'll learn about. Okay, John Marshall himself is appointed Chief Justice in the last days of Adams' term. He's going to be Chief Justice for 34 years, so a very long time. This man does not die, and essentially that becomes a problem for many of the other presidents up behind my head up there, because he's a Federalist and he remains doing Federalist stuff, like pro-strong national government stuff, long after the Federalist Party is way dead. The Federalist Party is in its twilight hours. It's going to end around the War of 1812, and no one else is really going to be a Federalist anymore. It's not going to be part of the two-party system. John Marshall continues it long after it's dead, okay? So here's where the midnight judges thing comes in. Essentially, one of these midnight judges, William Marbury, sued on behalf of himself and other judges that he was appointed before Adams, and then Adams is no longer president. All of a sudden, Jefferson is president, and his commission was not put through. And so his commission, his actual approved, you are a judge, was not put through by the Republicans. And so he sues it, makes it up to the Supreme Court, and essentially the case is dismissed. It's not super important, but what is important about it is that John Marshall looks at the Constitution to see, well, what does the Constitution say about this situation? And what he finds is that essentially the Judiciary Act of 1789, which Marbury had based his case, was unconstitutional because it gave the court the right to enforce appointments, and only the executive branch had the right to do that. So he says, let's just dismiss this case. But what did he do is what's important and what's significant. He looked at the Constitution, he looked at other federal laws and said, is this allowed? And that is called judicial review, the Supreme Court's power of reviewing laws for constitutionality. And that's not in the Constitution. It doesn't say that they're allowed to do that, but John Marshall did it, and he set this precedent throughout his time, his 34 years as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that this is what the Supreme Court does, and it's still what it does today. If this had not happened, Marbury versus Madison in 1803, the Supreme Court would be probably insignificant, and we wouldn't really be talking about it today. But this precedent is what gives the Supreme Court a lot more power than it had originally. Okay, so I told you that Thomas Jefferson getting rid of the Navy was going to come back and bite him in the butt, and here we go. We are going to fight a tiny little war. We don't even declare it as a war in Tripoli in Africa on the Mediterranean Sea, and it's because of the Barbary pirates that we have talked before. So remember, the Barbary pirates, they essentially, they were attacking ships trading in the Mediterranean. Great Britain, while we were still colonies, paid them off with a bribe to not attack their ships and our colony ships. Once the Revolutionary War is over and we are independent, Great Britain doesn't pay that bribe anymore, and Americans are like, oh, you pay them so they don't attack us? And now we've got this issue of pirates attacking our shipping and our trade on the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so what Jefferson had originally done is reduce the military and get rid of the Navy. Now we're fighting this issue. He's going to have to increase it again. Jefferson, just on principle, really fears large standing armies because he sees that as a group of people that could become a mob that take over. Instead, the small federal government should be in charge of a small federal army. But however, this pirate, the Barbary pirates, pick up in North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea, and those countries include Algiers, Tripoli, Morocco, and Tunis, I believe. And so essentially they're plundering, there are ships, they're blackmailing merchant ships in the Mediterranean, and Adams and Washington had just bought protection, essentially had bribed them off. But now the Pasha, I think it's Pasha of Tripoli, he's the king of Tripoli, declares war on the United States because once Jefferson becomes president, they no longer pay those bribes. And so Jefferson throws together a navy, sends them to the shores of Tripoli. That is in the a song, like the Navy's song and anthem. And there's 4 long years of fighting when finally a peace treaty is reached. But the peace treaty is only reached with the nation of Tripoli, not from Algiers, not from Morocco, not from Tunis, not from those pirates as well. So those issues are going to continue up until, honestly, the next war, the War of 1812. Jefferson, this fleet that he sends, the reason it's so ineffective and lasts so long is he orders this buildup of a fleet of small gunboats that many people call the mosquito fleet. So it's just not an effective navy, essentially. One of Jefferson's finest accomplishments is the Louisiana Purchase. So essentially, Napoleon Bonaparte he had bought this land previously from Spain. He was trying to build a new world empire, but is failing, and it's close to the end of his time as a leader of France and of this big world empire. And so he's trying to sell off a bunch of land that he has previously purchased. Essentially, Jefferson sends James Monroe to Paris, and he's told to buy New Orleans and as much land as he can for $10 million. Napoleon decided to sell all of Louisiana and up into the actual countryside as well for $15 million. And it's effective in that it was a lot of land for a little bit of money, 3 cents an acre, but it's going to cause an issue within Jefferson's heart, essentially. So why would Jefferson be weary of buying land for America? Jefferson is a strict constructionist. The Constitution does not specify land buying as a power of the president or of the federal government. So he accepts this treaty, although very reluctantly, and he says that he's making it a treaty so that the president's allowed to do it because the executive branch has the power to make treaties, but not to buy land. So he's kind of stretching the truth there, very much like a loose constructionist would do. Federalists are completely opposed to it, even though it's something that they would have probably done. Here's why. Ironically, they start arguing for strict constructionists. They say, the president does not have the power to buy land. Why are you doing that? And they say, no, it costs too much. Aren't you trying to balance the federal budget and make a smaller government? But the real reason that Federalists oppose it is because they're worried that Western lands and people that move out west and are more egalitarian and rural are going to be Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans and go against the Federalist policy. So here's where we see the difference between idealism and pragmatism. The Federalists are more idealists. They have their convictions, they have their beliefs, and they stick to them. And even if something was good, like buying land for the country is good, they wouldn't do it because it would go against their political party. They think people that move out there are going to be Republicans, and they don't want that. Whereas Jefferson, who his party is small government, they would say, no, the government doesn't have the power to do that. He does it. He buys Louisiana and the Louisiana Territory because he knows that it's going to be good for the country and good for democracy and good for American citizens who didn't have the ability to buy land. Land has already been grabbed up. They don't have a lot of money. Now they can move out west and buy land. It goes against his beliefs, but he does it for the good of the nation. That's pragmatism there. So who's already there? Natives already exist there. The land itself doubles the size of the United States. Originally, it was just from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Now we own from the Mississippi River all the way over to like Kansas area and even more above that. 3 cents an acre, $15 million. I think it was about $310 million in today's money. Now we have great ports for trading. Awesome ports for trading. Mississippi waterway to the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans, the entire Mississippi River, parts of the Missouri River as well. So trading is going to be a lot easier for Americans now that it's not being blocked by the French or the Spanish. So let westward expansion begin. But this is the sad crux of the situation. This is where a lot of historians point to the beginning of Indian removal. I mean, that precedent has been set since the colonies began, that colonists would just push them out of the way or exterminate them instead of trying to cohabitate. But in this time period, it really starts, oh, we have this land, well, let's get rid of the natives there so we can live there. That's the mentality. Instead of, oh, we have this land, there's people there already, let's try and live peacefully. Not what happens at all. Okay, so let's talk about who explores the purchase. The wilderness must be explored, okay? Meriwether Lewis and William Clark are going to be the two men sent by Thomas Jefferson. On the left, I'll get to that in a minute. So essentially, they will go on a 2-year journey from the Missouri River, starting where the Mississippi River meets Missouri, and up through the Rockies, along the Columbia River, even past Louisiana Territory into the Pacific Ocean, turn around and come back. They get the help in South Dakota of a Shoshone female, Sacagawea, who knew some English. She became their scout because she knows the land and she knows how to survive off of it, as well as their translator. So essentially, they could not have succeeded without her. This is a picture of her on the left. She did have a baby that she carried on her back traditionally. And the picture on the right is from Night at the Museum, which is a fantastic movie as well. One of my favorite things about Lewis and Clark is that they have, historically, they had a Newfoundland dog, Seaman, called such because he could swim very, very well. That's what Newfoundlands are bred to do. I know because I have a Newfoundland. It's my favorite type of dog. Okay, so let's discuss Aaron Burr, who has caused a lot of problems for Thomas Jefferson up to this point and will continue to do so. The first is an event we like to call Essex Junto, and the exploits of Aaron Burr will come to light during this time period. So Burr had run for president in 1796 against Adams, lost miserably, and against 1800, almost won, but lost again to Jefferson, and now he is vice president. A small group of Federalist extremists in New England, including even some like not New England states like New Jersey, New York, and then the true New England states, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont. They essentially come together and they want to secede from the Union, from the United States of America, and create a Federalist Northern Confederacy. And so these plotters are highly sectional Federalist. They feel very threatened by Thomas Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase and the idea of making America more equal and where everyone gets a vote, like democratic, like what Jefferson wanted. And so they court for a while Hamilton and say, Hamilton, why don't you run for governor of New York in 1804? And then from New York, you as governor lead the secessionist movement. 1 second. So Hamilton, essentially, they court him and say, hey, why don't you run for governor? And he says no. Then these Federalist extremists plot to court Aaron Burr and say, why don't you run for governor? And then lead the secession from there. He runs for governor in 1804. But Hamilton knows what's going on. He leads the opposition and convinces people not to vote for Burr's governorship in New York City, and Burr is defeated. Hamilton then exposed the plot and says this is what was going to happen if he was governor. Essentially, Burr could then get in trouble. Burr promptly challenges Hamilton to a duel, and kills him in 1804 in a gentleman's duel, which is all in the musical Hamilton, and it's so good. You should listen to the music. I put the link there if you would like to do that, okay? So that's not the only Aaron Burr problem. The other issue, 2 years later in 1806, Burr attempted to separate the western part of the United States from the eastern part and unite it with Spanish territory and become its own sort of little pseudo-country. The plot is originally supported by the governor of Louisiana, part of the western part of the country, but then later exposed the plot to President Jefferson, and Burr is arrested in 1806, led to a trial in Richmond, Virginia, but it's all dismissed because there's no witnesses. But essentially, Burr's political career, done for. He has shot an important political official, Hamilton. He has been exposed of trying to secede from the nation by 2 different plots, the conspiracy and the Essex Junto. And so essentially Burr's political career is all but over. So the tensions between Great Britain and France are going to cause issues during Jefferson's presidency as well. In 1805, Great Britain controls most of the seas with their awesome navy, but France is controlling a lot of the European continent, and they're at war with each other thanks to our boy Napoleon. So the British begin seizing American ships because they want to end the United States trading with France and then re-exporting those goods and making money for themselves and also for the French. And so a lot of British ships are harassing United States ships. So in 1806, Napoleon puts forth the Berlin Decree, and this is what it is. It essentially, Napoleon says that he's going to close ports of the continent to British commerce. So all of the European continent, closing it to British commerce, no British ships, and outlawing all trade on the continent with the British Isles. Well, guess what? England, in response, issues the Order in Council. Great Britain issues the Order in Council, which says that any ports under French continental control will be closed to foreign shipping, and they will not tolerate anyone who trades with France, and they themselves will not be trading with France. Well, guess what? American ships that didn't stop at Great Britain prior to entering the continent would be confiscated by the British Navy, who is now patrolling the waters. So America can't trade with the French, and the French are saying, America, you can't trade with Great Britain. France responds with the Milan Decree. Again, they're just being petty and fighting with each other. As Napoleon's retaliation to the Order in Council, essentially any neutral ship entering a British port or submitting to a British warship at sea would be confiscated if it tried to enter a French or European continent port. So they're just getting back at each other based on their fighting with each other, and now they are targeting the United States, who's trying to trade with both of them. So Jefferson responds with a very ill-fated act and not well thought out called the Embargo Act. It's hastily passed through Congress. It forbids all exports of goods from the United States. A reason that a U.S. embargo would make sure that Britain and France respect the United States and respect their rights to trade neutrally as a neutral country in their own little Napoleonic war, okay? But why would Jefferson do this? Jefferson is a loose constructionist. I'm sorry, Jefferson is a strict constructionist, and this is a loose constructionist thing. Yeah, Congress can regulate commerce, but does that mean they have the power to cut off all trade with other nations? That's exactly what he's doing. It undermines Jefferson's states' rights, small federal government idea that he's been saying since he's become a political official. It's essentially a disaster. In 1807, the U.S. exports were $108 million. But in 1808, after the embargo, $22 million. And New England's trade was mostly affected because they were the ones that were industrious and had the manufacturing and shipping ports. The South and the West had these large grain and storage bins full of cotton, tobacco, and grain that's completely unsold, just sitting there, not being sold because they can't trade it with other countries. So a lot of ways that people get around this is through illegal trade. We're going to see a lot more smuggling and a lot more trading, mostly at the Canadian border in the New England area. And many people viewed this as tyrannical, that Jefferson was taking way too much power, going against what he believes with to begin with. But this remains a U.S. policy for quite some time, up until the War of 1812. I apologize, I got that wrong. The Embargo Act ends in 1809. The Non-Intercourse Act, what I'm about to talk about, remains a policy until the War of 1812. So here's what it is. They realize the Embargo Act is a freaking disaster, and they're losing all their money, and they're wasting a bunch of farm of crops. And so they passed the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, which replaced the Embargo Act. Essentially, it formally reopens trade with everyone except France and Britain, who were causing problems. Much better idea. Should have done that in the first place. But essentially, the embargo failed on many, many levels. The U.S. overestimated how much Great Britain and France really depend on U.S. trade, and they overestimated how much the British actually care about the United States in general. The embargo was not, in fact, long enough or administered tightly enough. There's too much smuggling. There's too much ways to get around it for it to really be effective and really cut off America from the world and make them hurt because of it. The Embargo Act actually was more costly than a war itself would have been. The U.S. lost an opportunity by losing a bunch of money to build a strong navy that they could have fought a better war in. And it worsened the conflict between Great Britain and France because no matter what, the United States citizens were still trading, and there was still tension between Great Britain and France over who gets to trade with the United States. Great Britain was hit harder by the embargo. France liked that they were hit harder by the embargo. France starts seizing American ships, so now it's very unsafe to be an American ship in Atlantic waters. In ideas of success, New England, because of the embargo, becomes more self-sufficient in the way of we don't have to buy things from them even though we want to. We can make things for ourselves. So that goes against Jefferson's vision of he wants everyone to be rural farmers. Well, now we've got more manufacturing thanks to your Embargo Act. Great Britain was very much hurt by the lack of cotton due to the Embargo Act as well, which made people that didn't like Great Britain, like Jefferson, feel very good about themselves. All right. Sorry, let me get my stuff together here. Oh my goodness. Okay, so here is a political cartoon of the Embargo Act, and this is one of my favorite political cartoons. I'm going to explain to you why. So on the left, we have an elitist, or possibly Thomas Jefferson, saying, darn, how he nicks them, talking about the turtle. The turtle represents the Embargo Act, and it has in many different political cartoons leading up to this time, and the turtle is stepping on a license to trade and ship. And so off on the right, in the middle of the political cartoon, we have a British ship, and we have Americans essentially right here trying to smuggle goods to sell to the British. And so this man right here said, oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. Now, what is an oh, grab me? It's embargo spelled backwards. So he's saying, oh, this embargo is stopping me from making money where I could be selling stuff to the British. So it shows Americans' discontent. The significance, the why is it important if we were to hippie this? It shows America's discontent with the Embargo Act. Okay, so let's discuss Jefferson's legacy. Part of Jefferson's legacy is desire for expansion and resulting in the Louisiana Purchase and other types of expansion. So he's seen as a success in buying the Louisiana Purchase and in pushing Americans to move towards Spanish Florida and trying to negotiate with Spain over the acquisition of Florida. The War of 1812 is not during, let me check that real quick. Yeah, it's not during Jefferson's presidency. I had to check my dates real quick. But the issues like the Barbary Pirates and those issues will lead up to the War of 1812, especially all the issues between Great Britain and France. The hard side, the bad side about this expansionist policy is that Jefferson remains silent on the idea of Indians. And so Indian removal, this precedent that colonists set during the age of exploration, the age of colonization, that just get the Native Americans out of the way so that white people can live there, that continues. And as well as the idea that those moving out west, Jefferson's idea he said they should be white people establishing their own farms and making it, not any people of color, natives or black, okay? So Jefferson's Democratic Republican ideas of a government that governs least governs best does stick as his legacy. He wanted this agrarian society where people are equal, egalitarian, more middle class and lower class farmers, and he wanted the people to feel like their government was run by the regular people, government for the people, common people and common democracy. Essentially, the Federalist Party is going to die during his presidency, except for John Marshall, and most people will not be considered Federalists anymore. After his presidency in the election of 1808, James Madison runs as a Democratic Republican. There are some Federalists, but the party's dying out, and James Madison easily takes the presidency. Some historians argue that Thomas Jefferson is really the person that set a precedent for a two-term presidency and that George Washington was just tired and that's why he did it. Whereas Jefferson could have continued going, he feared that more than 2 terms would lead to a dictatorship. But Jefferson could have easily served more terms. However, Madison, his successor, the person that came after him, was very, very much like Jefferson. So it was kind of like Jefferson's 3rd term, just a different person, James Madison. We look at our current legacy of Thomas Jefferson, and it's kind of controversial. All men are created equal, he wrote, and yet he owned slaves and sometimes promoted the expansion of slavery and sometimes promoted the end of slavery. And so his current legacy is quite controversial, okay? So keep that in mind when you are thinking and writing about Thomas Jefferson's 2-term presidency, the turmoil that was experienced with the trade issues, the embargo issues, the Embargo Act between Great Britain and France and the United States, and also the foreign policy issues when it came to the pirates in Africa, and the domestic issues where people were conspiring against him. There was still division amongst the nation. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything. Remember that his presidency started with a peaceful transfer of power. He maintained some Federalist programs as a pragmatist. He knew they were good for the nation, even if he didn't agree with them, while still pushing his agenda as a Democratic Republican. He reversed a lot of programs as well, such as the whiskey tax, sedition acts, and alien naturalization laws, trying to make the country more of what his idea was, which was equal.